The air in the lobby of the Crestwood Performing Arts Center always felt different to her. It wasn't just the temperature, which was always kept a little too cool, but the quality of the silence. It was a heavy, expectant kind of quiet, filled with the ghosts of 1,000 performances. Tonight, that silence was especially thick. It was the night of the regional finals for the Young Classical Pianists competition, and the place was buzzing with a kind of nervous energy that was almost silent. She could feel it on her skin, a low-voltage hum of ambition and anxiety. She had just finished her last round of cleaning. The floors were polished to a mirror shine, the glass doors were free of a single fingerprint, and the trash cans were empty. Her official shift was over, but she couldn't bring herself to leave. Not yet. She had traded her gray janitor's uniform for her everyday clothes, a pair of faded jeans that were soft from years of wear, and a simple, dark blue hoodie. It was her armor, a way to blend into the background, to become invisible. And in this world, invisibility was what she craved. She stood near a large marble pillar, half hidden in its shadow, and just watched. The lobby was filled with people who seemed to belong to a different species. They moved with a certain grace, their backs straight, their chins up. The young pianists, some looking as young as 15, were dressed in elegant black and white. The boys wore crisp shirts and tailored trousers, their hair neatly combed. The girls were in simple black dresses or sleek skirts, their hair pulled back in severe buns that highlighted their sharp, focused cheekbones. They were like a flock of exotic, beautiful birds, all preening and pacing, their slender fingers constantly in motion, tapping out silent rhythms on their own arms on the velvet ropes. On the air itself, she saw a girl with a pearl necklace practicing a trill so fast her fingers were just a blur. A tall boy with a nervous tic kept wiping his sweaty palms on his perfectly pressed trousers. Their parents hovered nearby, a cloud of expensive perfume and quiet, firm encouragement. "Remember your dynamics," a woman whispered to her son, her hand resting on his shoulder. "Just play from the heart, sweetheart," a man said to his daughter, though his tight smile suggested he was hoping for much more than just heart. From her spot in the shadows, she felt a world away. These people had a language she didn't speak, a currency she couldn't access. Their lives were paved with music lessons, expensive instruments, and connections. Her life was paved with late-night shifts, ramen noodles, and a beat-up old upright piano she'd bought for $50 from a thrift store. It was missing 2 keys and had a persistent buzz in the middle C, but it was hers. It was her voice. Her eyes were drawn, as they always were, to the center of the grand lobby. There it sat, the Steinway. It was a concert grand, finished in a deep, lustrous black that seemed to drink the light from the crystal chandeliers hanging above. It wasn't just a piano. It was a monument. A king on its throne, waiting for its chosen subjects to come and pay homage. Its lid was propped open, revealing the gleaming strings and hammers inside, like the intricate workings of a clockwork heart. To her, it was the most beautiful and terrifying object in the world. She knew every inch of that piano, not from playing it, but from cleaning it. She knew the feel of the special polished cloth on its smooth surface, the way she had to be so careful not to leave a single streak. She knew the way the dust settled in the tight spaces between the keys. She had gently wiped the ivory keys herself, her own rough, work-worn fingers feeling a strange sense of reverence, as they touched the same surfaces that the fingers of masters would soon touch. She had never, ever dared to press one down. That was a line she would not cross. It would be like a commoner trying on the queen's crown. It just wasn't done. A wave of longing, so sharp and sudden it almost took her breath away, washed over her. It was a familiar ache, a constant companion. She imagined what it would feel like to sit on that polished bench, to feel the solid weight of the keys beneath her fingers. She knew with a certainty that chilled her that she could make that piano sing, she could make it weep, she could make it roar. The music was inside her, a storm that had been building for years, with no place to break free. It was a symphony of all the things she couldn't say, all the frustrations and quiet hopes she carried every day. She watched as a distinguished-looking man with a silver mane of hair walked past the piano, giving it an affectionate pat on its side as he would a prized horse. He was one of the judges. She had seen his picture on the competition posters. He was talking to another man in a tuxedo, and they both laughed, a deep, rumbling sound that echoed in the high-ceilinged room. They were so comfortable here, so at ease. This was their world. She was just a ghost, a fleeting presence who would be forgotten the moment the final note was played and the lights went down. She pulled the sleeves of her hoodie down over her hands, a small self-protective gesture. She should go home. She had a long bus ride ahead of her, and she needed to be up early for her morning shift at the small cafe where she worked weekends. But her feet felt rooted to the spot. Her gaze was locked on the piano, on the perfect, inviting row of white and black keys. They were like a promise, a secret waiting to be told. The lobby was starting to empty out as the contestants were called into the hall for a pre-competition briefing. The hum of energy subsided, replaced by that heavy, expectant silence again. Soon, she would be alone with the cleaning supplies and the echoes. But for now, in this quiet moment, she was just a girl in a faded hoodie, standing in the shadow of a dream, and the piano was calling to her with a silent, irresistible song. The quiet didn't last. The heavy wooden doors at the far end of the lobby swung open, and the spell was broken. The sound of many voices and the soft, purposeful shuffle of expensive shoes filled the space. The contestants and their parents were returning from their briefing, their faces a mixture of renewed determination and fresh anxiety. The air, once still and sacred, was now alive with a low, humming energy again. But she didn't notice any of this. She was still lost in her own world, a world that consisted only of her and the beautiful, silent piano. She took a step forward, then another. It was an unconscious movement, like a sleepwalker drawn to a single point of light. Her focus was so complete that the rest of the lobby had simply faded away. The marble pillars, the crystal chandeliers, the people, they were all just a blurry backdrop. All that was real was the gleaming black wood, the perfect curve of the lid, and the 88 black and white keys that promised a universe of sound. She was close enough now to see her own faint reflection in the polished surface. A distorted shape in a blue hoodie, her hand, acting on its own, rose from her side. It wasn't a decision, but an impulse, a deep, primal need to connect. Her fingers, still a little rough from her cleaning work, reached out toward the keys. She wasn't going to play. She knew she couldn't. She just wanted to feel it. To touch one key, just for a second, to know what it felt like. It was a secret, foolish desire, a moment of pure, unthinking vulnerability. Her fingertips were just an inch away from the cool, white ivory of a middle C when a sharp, shocked gasp cut through the air like a piece of broken glass. "Look!" The voice was female, high and laced with disbelief. It sliced through her trance, and the blurry world snapped back into sharp, painful focus. She froze, her hand hovering in the air, caught in the act. Her eyes darted to the side, and she saw them. A group of contestants and their parents were standing just a few feet away, staring at her. Their faces were a mixture of shock, confusion, and something else. Something colder. Another voice, a boy this time, laced with a lazy, arrogant amusement. "Well, what do we have here? Is she lost?" A titter of laughter ran through the group. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp and cruel, each little giggle like a tiny needle prick on her skin. Her face began to burn, a hot, prickling flush that started in her neck and crept up to her ears. She snatched her hand back as if she had been electrocuted and shoved it deep into the pocket of her hoodie. "Does she think she's one of the contestants?" A girl with a diamond hairpin sneered, looking her up and down. Her eyes lingered on the worn jeans and faded hoodie with open disgust. "Maybe she's the entertainment for the intermission," the boy with the arrogant smirk added. And this time the laughter was louder, more confident. It was a pack finding its prey. More people were turning to look now, their conversations dying as they focused on the strange girl by the piano. The center of attention was the last place she ever wanted to be, and now she was trapped there, pinned by 100 judgmental eyes. "I can't believe she touched it," a woman whispered to her husband, her voice a harsh stage whisper. Her hands, "They're probably filthy." The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders, making it hard to breathe. She wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. She wanted to become invisible, to melt back into the shadows and disappear. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to turn around, push through the crowd, and not stop until she was out on the street, gasping for air in the cool night. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, and her eyes started to sting. She wouldn't cry. She wouldn't give them that satisfaction. She took a shaky step back, her head bowed, her gaze fixed on the polished floor. She could see their reflections in the marble, a circle of elegant, mocking faces. She was a joke. A ridiculous, pathetic joke. The girl in the hoodie who thought she could touch a piano like that. She felt a familiar wave of self-doubt wash over her, the same voice that always whispered in her ear late at night. Asterisk, who do you think you are? You're nothing. You're a cleaner. You don't belong here, asterisk. She turned, her shoulders slumped in defeat, ready to flee. But as she took her second step, something inside her shifted. It was a tiny, hard spark of anger that flickered to life in the pit of her stomach. It was small at first, but it was hot and bright. Why? A voice inside her demanded. Asterisk, why should I be the one who runs? Why should I be the one who is ashamed? Asterisk, she stopped walking. Her hands, still in her pockets, clenched into tight fists. She thought of her own piano, sitting in the corner of her small apartment. She thought of the chipped wood, the yellowed keys, the way the middle C buzzed if you held it down for too long. She thought of the hours she had spent on that bench, pouring all her frustration, her loneliness and her quiet hopes into those worn-out keys. That piano was her best friend, her confidant, her voice. The love she had for music wasn't less than theirs. It wasn't a hobby she picked up to win competitions or impress her parents. It was a part of her soul, as essential as breathing. The anger grew, pushing back the shame. These people didn't know her. They didn't know about the nights she fell asleep at her keyboard, or the way she would save for months just to buy a piece of classical sheet music. They saw her clothes and her job, and they built a story around it. A story of someone who didn't belong. And in that moment, she decided she was tired of their story. She took a deep, shaky breath, and it felt like the first real breath she had taken all night. She straightened her back, pulling her shoulders back. The slouch disappeared, replaced by a quiet, rigid posture. Slowly, deliberately, she turned around to face them. To face the piano. The laughter in the room started to die down, replaced by confused murmurs. She wasn't running. She was walking back toward the piano. Her steps were firm and purposeful now. She ignored the shocked faces, the wide eyes, the open mouths. Her world had shrunk again, but this time it wasn't just her and the piano. It was her, the piano, and the silent challenge she was issuing to everyone in the room. She reached the bench and, without a moment's hesitation, sat down. The polished wood was cool against her legs. She ran her hands over her thighs, smoothing the fabric of her jeans. Then she placed her fingers on the keys, not hesitantly this time, but with a natural, easy familiarity. Her right foot found the pedal. The lobby was now completely silent. The mocking crowd was gone, replaced by a sea of stunned, waiting faces. They were expecting a clumsy, discordant mess. They were waiting for the punchline to the joke. But as she sat there, her fingers poised, her expression calm and focused, a new feeling began to ripple through the onlookers. It wasn't mockery anymore. It was confusion, and a tiny, flickering spark of fear. They had a feeling they had made a terrible mistake. The silence that fell over the lobby was a heavy, suffocating blanket. It wasn't the respectful, hushed quiet that comes before a performance. This was a stunned, awkward silence, thick with confusion and unspoken questions. Every eye was on her, the girl in the faded hoodie who had just committed a social crime by sitting at the piano. From her seat on the polished bench, she could feel the weight of 100 stares, each one a physical pressure against her back. Her heart was still a frantic drum against her ribs, a wild, chaotic rhythm that clashed with the stillness of the room. But beneath the fear, something else was taking root. It was a strange, steely calm, the quiet eye of the storm that had been raging inside her. A wave of whispers started to ripple through the crowd, like a breeze rustling through dry leaves. "Is she serious?" A girl in a black velvet dress hissed to her friend. "She can't actually be planning to play, can she?" The arrogant boy, the one who had made the joke about her being the intermission entertainment, had his arms crossed over his chest. His smirk was still there, but it was tighter now, tinged with a genuine disbelief. He looked at his friends, raising an eyebrow as if to say, well, this should be good. They were all waiting for the crash. They were waiting for the discordant, clumsy mess of notes that would confirm their judgment, that would make them feel secure in their own superior world. They wanted a punchline, and she was the setup, but she wasn't thinking about them anymore. As she sat there, her fingers resting lightly on the cool, smooth edges of the keys, the world outside the piano began to fade. The whispers, the stares, the judgment, it all melted into a distant, irrelevant hum. Her focus narrowed until all that existed was the 80 black and white keys in front of her and the universe of sound they held. This was her territory. This was the one place where she wasn't a poor girl in a hoodie or a janitor who cleaned up after other people's dreams. Here she was an equal. Here she could speak a language more powerful and more true than any words. She let her fingers drift over the keys, not pressing them down, just feeling their familiar shape. Her right hand found a comfortable position over the middle register, her thumb gently grazing the C key. Her left hand settled lower down, ready to provide the foundation. There was no hesitation in her movements, no uncertainty. Her hands knew this dance, even if this particular partner was far more elegant and responsive than the old, beat-up upright she had at home. She could feel the potential energy thrumming through the instrument, a coiled spring waiting to be released. It was a feeling she knew well, a feeling that was both terrifying and exhilarating. The crowd watched, their confusion growing. The girl they had laughed at was gone. In her place was someone else, someone with a quiet confidence that was unnerving. Her posture was straight, her shoulders relaxed. Her gaze was fixed on the keys, not with the nervous look of an amateur, but with the focused intensity of a master craftsman examining their tools. The boy's smirk had completely vanished, replaced by a slight frown. The girl with the diamond hairpin was no longer whispering. She was just staring, her mouth slightly agape. They had expected a clown, but they were seeing a gladiator preparing for battle. She took a slow, deep breath, filling her lungs with the cool, conditioned air. She thought of her small apartment, of the lumpy mattress on the floor, of the stack of bills on her kitchen counter. She thought of the long hours on her feet, the aching muscles, the constant quiet struggle of her life. And then she thought of the music. The music was her escape, her sanctuary. It was the place where all the pain and frustration and loneliness could be transformed into something beautiful. It was the only thing that was truly hers, a memory surfaced unbidden. She was 10 years old, standing in a music store, pressing her nose against the glass of a display case. Inside was a small, silver music box, and when you wound it up, it played a tiny, delicate melody. She had saved her allowance for months to buy it. It was the first beautiful thing she had ever owned. That little melody was the seed from which everything else had grown. It was a reminder that beauty didn't have to be expensive or exclusive. It could be small and hidden and still have the power to heal. She closed her eyes for just a second, blocking out the room, the people, the expectations. In that moment of darkness, she made her choice. She wasn't going to play a simple tune. She wasn't going to play a popular song. She was going to play them the truth. She was going to play the storm that lived inside her, the symphony of her own life. She was going to show them that the most powerful music doesn't come from a fancy school or an expensive instrument. It comes from the soul. Her eyes opened. They were clear and bright and utterly fearless. She looked out at the crowd for the first time since she had sat down, not seeing individuals, but seeing a single, breathing entity of doubt and prejudice. She had nothing to say to them. Her hands would speak for her. Her fingers, which had been resting so gently, suddenly changed their posture. They curved, becoming strong and poised. Her wrists lifted slightly from the bench, ready to channel the energy from her entire body, from her entire life into the waiting strings and hammers. The air in the lobby felt thick, charged with an electricity that made the hairs on people's arms stand up. The silence was no longer awkward. It was sacred. It was the breathless pause before the plunge, and then it began. Her right thumb pressed down on the middle C. It wasn't a soft, hesitant note. It was a firm, clear, resonant sound that cut through the silence like a knife. It was a declaration, a single, perfect note that hung in the air, vibrating with a power that seemed to shake the very foundations of the room. It was a sound that held no apology, no fear. It was a sound that said, asterisk, I am here, and you are going to listen. Asterisk, the crowd, who had been leaning forward in anticipation of a joke, froze. Their faces, masks of smug curiosity, shattered. In that single, perfect note, they knew they had made a terrible, terrible mistake. That single, perfect note was a key, turning in a lock, opening a floodgate. Before the last vibration of the middle C had even faded into the air, her fingers came to life. They didn't just play the piano. They attacked it, caressed it, and commanded it all at once. A torrent of sound erupted from the Steinway, a complex, cascading river of notes that was so fast and intricate it seemed impossible for only two hands to be creating it. It was a classical run, the kind of disciplined, flawless technique that the contestants in the room had spent a lifetime trying to perfect. But there was something different about it. Beneath the perfect mathematical precision of the notes, there was a raw, untamed energy, a grit and a soul that no music school could ever teach. For the first few seconds, the crowd was simply stunned into silence by the sheer technical skill. The arrogant boy's mouth fell open. The girl with the diamond hairpin instinctively took a step back, as if the sound itself had physical force. They had been expecting a clumsy, childlike tune. Instead, they were witnessing a level of mastery that was far beyond anything they had seen from their fellow competitors. But then the music began to change. The intricate, classical melody began to bend. A blue note, a sound that was full of ache and longing, crept into the sequence. It was a subtle shift, like a drop of ink in a glass of water, but it changed the entire color of the music. The piece she was playing was her own. It was a story she had been writing for years, a story that had no words, only sound. It began with the chaos of her daily life. The fast, overlapping runs represented the relentless pace of her two jobs. The constant worry about bills, the feeling of always being one step behind. It was the sound of a city that never sleeps, the sound of a life lived on the edge. Her left hand laid down a steady, driving rhythm, a heartbeat of pure determination against the storm of her right hand's melody. Then the music softened. The frantic pace slowed and the classical structure gave way to something more raw and vulnerable. A series of deep, moaning chords filled the lobby, each one heavy with a sorrow so profound it was almost tangible. This was the sound of her loneliness. It was the feeling of coming home to an empty apartment, the ache of having so much to say and no one to say it to. It was the memory of cold winters and thinner blankets than she would have liked. The notes were no longer just notes. They were cries. They were the sound of tears falling on the worn-out keys of her old piano, the sound of a heart breaking in silence. A few people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, their own carefully constructed composure cracking. This wasn't just music. It was an emotional confession, and it was painfully, beautifully honest. But just as the sadness threatened to pull the entire piece under, a new sound emerged, a spark of defiance. Her fingers struck a series of sharp, powerful chords that were filled with anger and fire. This was the part of her that had refused to give up. It was the rage she felt at being judged, the frustration of being invisible, the burning desire to be seen for who she truly was. The music was a fight now. The bluesy wails and the disciplined classical runs were battling each other, clashing, and then weaving together in a complex, passionate dance. It was the sound of her inner war, the constant struggle between the person the world saw and the person she knew she was inside. Her body was swaying with the music, her eyes closed, her face a mask of pure emotion. She was no longer the girl in the hoodie. She was a conduit, a vessel for a story that was bigger than herself. Her hands flew across the keys, sometimes a blur of motion, sometimes pressing down with a force that seemed to come from the very core of her being. She wasn't just thinking about the notes. She was reliving every moment that had inspired them. The sweat on her brow wasn't from the heat of the lobby lights. It was the sweat of her labor, her struggle, her life. The crowd was no longer a collection of individuals. They had become a single, breathing entity, completely captivated. The social barriers had dissolved. The rich parents, the ambitious students, the staff, they were all just people, united by the overwhelming power of the music. The arrogant boy looked humbled, his eyes wide with a dawning respect. He was a good technician, but he was realizing, for the first time, that technique was only the language. The music was the story, and he had no story like this to tell. The girl with the diamond hairpin had a single tear tracing a path through her carefully applied makeup. She had always seen music as a tool to win, a way to get ahead. She had never understood that it could be a way to survive. The music built towards its climax. The sadness, the anger, the chaos, and the defiance all began to merge into a single overwhelming wave of sound. It was a roar of pure, unadulterated passion. It was the sound of a soul that had been caged for too long finally breaking free. The notes were no longer just beautiful or sad. They were transcendent. They filled every corner of the vast lobby, vibrating in the marble floors and the crystal chandeliers. It was a sound that seemed to say, asterisk, I have been through hell, and I am still here. I am stronger for it, and I will not be silent, asterisk, and then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. Her hands came down on the keyboard one last time, striking a final, magnificent chord that was filled with all the complexity of the piece that had come before it. It was a sound that was both a resolution and a question. It was a statement of survival, a cry of victory, and a whisper of hope, all held within a single, perfect vibration. She held her hands on the keys, her chest heaving, her body trembling with the effort. The final chord hung in the air, shimmering and alive, refusing to die. It filled the silence that followed, a silence so complete and so profound that it was louder than any applause. No one moved, no one spoke. They just stood there in the echo of her story, their world forever changed by the girl in the faded hoodie who had dared to touch the piano. The final chord didn't just end. It dissolved. It hung in the air of the grand lobby, a shimmering, living thing that refused to die. It vibrated in the polished marble floors, in the crystal chandeliers, and deep inside the chest of every person present. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full. It was packed so tightly with the echoes of the story she had just told that there was no room for anything else. No one moved. No one dared to breathe too loudly. It was as if they were all afraid that the slightest sound might shatter the fragile, beautiful moment, like a soap bubble catching the light on the bench. She was trembling. The adrenaline that had carried her through the piece was receding, leaving behind a vast, empty exhaustion. Her fingers were still resting on the keys, but they felt numb, disconnected from her body. Her shoulders ached, and her lungs burned for air she hadn't realized she was holding. Slowly, she became aware of the world outside the piano again. The weight of the stairs returned, but it was different now. It wasn't the sharp, judgmental pressure from before. It was a heavy, awestruck blanket. She could feel their eyes on her, not as a spectacle to be mocked, but as a phenomenon to be understood. She didn't dare look up. She was afraid of what she would see. Afraid that the magic would vanish, and she would be just a girl in a hoodie again, exposed and foolish. Then a sound broke the spell. It was a single, sharp clap. It came from an older man who had been standing near the back of the crowd, almost unnoticed. He was one of the judges, the distinguished-looking man with the silver mane of hair she had seen earlier. He hadn't been with the main group of mockers. He had entered quietly during her performance and had stood there, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Now his face was a mask of profound wonder. His clap was not a gesture of polite appreciation. It was a verdict. It was a hammer striking an anvil, a clear, Resonant sound that declared the truth of what had just happened. That single clap was the catalyst. A young man in the front, the arrogant boy who had been the first to laugh, flinched as if he'd been struck. He looked at the judge, then back at the girl at the piano, and his face crumpled with a dawning, painful understanding. He slowly brought his hands together. Another person joined in. Then another. The applause started as a scattered, hesitant rain, but it quickly grew into a thundering, overwhelming storm. It wasn't the polite, obligatory clapping you hear at a recital. This was a roar. It was a tidal wave of sound, a release of all the tension, emotion, and awe that had been building in the room. It was the sound of 100 hearts being broken open and put back together in the same instant. The girl on the bench finally looked up. The sea of faces before her was a blur, but she could see the change. The girl with the diamond hairpin was crying openly, her hands pressed to her mouth. The parents were looking at their own children with a new, more complex expression, as if seeing them for the first time. The applause washed over her, but it felt distant, like the sound of the ocean from a faraway shore. She wasn't feeling triumphant. She was feeling vulnerable. She had just taken her soul, with all its scars and its beauty, and laid it bare for these people to see. And now they were applauding its pain. It was all too much. She started to slide off the bench, intending to slip away in the chaos, to disappear before the spell was truly broken. But as she stood up on shaky legs, the crowd parted. And through the aisle they made for him, the judge with the silver hair was walking toward her. He moved slowly, with a deliberate grace that commanded respect. The applause softened as people turned to watch him, a hush falling over the room once more. He walked onto the small stage, his shoes making no sound on the polished wood, and stopped a few feet away from her. He didn't offer his hand. He didn't say, "Bravo." He just looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep, searching kindness. "I have been judging these competitions for 30 years, he said, his voice quiet but clear, carrying easily in the silent room. In that time, I have heard thousands of pianists. Some were machines. They played every note perfectly, with flawless technique. They were impressive, but they were empty." He paused, his gaze never leaving hers. You are not empty. You didn't just play notes. You told us the truth. You reminded all of us why we started playing in the first place. Not to win, not to be better than someone else, but to feel something real. A single tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away with the sleeve of her hoodie. Feeling a fresh wave of embarrassment, the judge saw it and a gentle smile touched his lips. "Don't be ashamed of that," he said softly. "That is the most honest thing I have seen all night." He took a small step closer. "This competition," he said, gesturing vaguely to the room, "is for technicians. It has rules and expectations. You don't belong in a competition. You belong on a stage." He let that sink in before asking the simplest and most profound question of all. "What is your name?" She whispered it so softly he had to lean in to hear her. The sound of her own name, spoken in this context, felt alien and powerful. It was the key that unlocked the final cage. She was no longer the girl in the hoodie or the janitor or the joke. She had a name, he nodded, as if it was the most important piece of information he had ever received. "Well," he said, his voice full of a new energy, "I cannot offer you a prize because you did not enter the contest, but I can offer you something better." He took a card from his jacket pocket and held it out to her. "This is the number of the head of admissions at the city's premier conservatory. I'm on the board there. I will tell them you are coming. They will give you an audition. A real one, not a competition. A chance." He looked at her worn jeans, her faded hoodie, her tired, tear-streaked face, and he saw not what she was, but what she could be. "The world needs to hear your story," he said. "Don't ever let anyone make you feel like you shouldn't be the one to tell it." She took the card with a trembling hand. It was just a piece of paper, but it felt heavier than a brick. It was solid. It was real. It was a door. She didn't know what to say, so she just nodded, a silent, tearful promise. The judge gave her a final, reassuring nod, and then turned to address the room, but she didn't hear his words. She carefully tucked the card into her pocket right next to the worn-out key to her small apartment. She took one last look at the piano, her piano, and then she turned and walked away. The crowd was still watching, their faces filled with a respect that felt warmer than the grandest applause. They parted for her as she walked through the lobby, a silent, reverent path to the door. She stepped out into the cool night air. The city sounds of traffic and distant sirens rushed in to fill the silence around her. It was the same world she had left an hour ago, but it felt completely different. The streetlights seemed brighter, the air seemed cleaner. She looked back at the grand, glowing building, not with longing, but with a quiet sense of closure. She had walked in an outsider, a ghost. She was walking out a musician. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, she could see a path forward. And as she started the long walk to the bus stop, her hands deep in her pockets, her fingers brushed against the stiff edge of the judge's card. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that the music was no longer just a secret she kept in the dark. It was a light, and it was finally time to let it shine.